American students' protests give them a seat at decision-making table in Montclair. Institutional racism thriving in America. Peter N. Kirsanaw, The Systemic Racism. Students and alums reveal racist culture at top Chicago private school. More than 50 majority white schools exposed for racism thanks to Black at Instagram accounts. Enough is enough. Institutional racism has existed in many ways over the course of the United States education system, beginning with the segregation of schools to now providing less resources, lower quality education, and psychological disadvantages purely based on race. As time has passed, however, we have begun to realize our mistakes. In 1965, the law known as Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, which allocated more resources to the minority populations to try to lessen the gap of inequalities. This was later followed by the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 and the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. Racial inequalities have always existed in the education system, and the problem is far from solved, but society is getting closer every year. Brookings.edu provides a great deal of knowledge about the progress of racial inequality, with very interesting studies including one about factors that influence student achievement. These 4 factors are smaller schools where they can get adequate attention, smaller class sizes, a challenging curriculum, and highly qualified teachers. As mentioned in the article, schools mostly consisting of minorities have the opposite of these factors, with larger schools and thus larger class sizes, lower quality classes and curriculum, and less qualified teachers. The issues surrounding racial inequalities in education are never-ending, but the main problems we are focused on in this public service announcement are underfunded schools of minorities and the scoring system of standardized tests in schools with less resources. Due to the deeply rooted cultural racism prevalent in the American education system today, minorities are subject to poorly allocated monetary and academic resources.
Is the United States a meritocracy? As we have explored the idea of meritocracy in class, we ask our audience to reflect on the previous part of the video and how it relates to the United States being a meritocracy. In the last part of the video, we explored the multitude of faults in standardized testing, especially for minority student scores, which leads us to believe that though the American school system appears to be meritocratic, factors such as racism in education result in false representations of merit on things like standardized tests. Ultimately, we do not believe the American education system is entirely meritocratic.
Detroit and Grosse Pointe, 2 worlds that couldn't be more different, are separated by only a street. On one side of Mack Avenue lies what is typically described as the American dream, a suburban paradise filled with lush green lawns, white picket fences, and large, lustrous homes. On the opposite side of Mack Avenue lies one of America's most disastrous financial crises, the city of Detroit. According to the United States Census, the median income per household of Detroit residents is about $17,000. 36% of citizens are in poverty. The median value of housing units in Detroit is $45,000. 78% of Detroit is Black. On the other hand, Grosse Pointe is 93% white. The median income per household of Grosse Pointe residents is $108,000. Only 2% of citizens are in poverty. The median value of housing units in Grosse Pointe is $348,000. The public school systems in Detroit and Grosse Pointe mirror their communities financially and racially. The Detroit public school system is in a state of disarray, financially and academically, while Grosse Pointe public schools are well kept and offer their students many academic advantages. Detroit public schools boasts a massive student population of over 50,000 students. 97% of students in Detroit's public school system are not white. 41,000 are Black, 6,000 are Hispanic, and only about 1,000 are white. Across the street, it's an entirely different story. Grosse Pointe public schools do not serve even a fifth of the students that Detroit does. Grosse Pointe contains only about 8,000 students, and 73% of these students are white. Grosse Pointe School District performs astronomically higher than Detroit. When it comes to how much funding is received by each school district, the numbers are a bit disproportionate. In the 2018-2019 school year, Detroit received an overall sum of about $15,000 per student, while Grosse Pointe received an overall sum of about $14,000 per student. Even though Detroit receives more government funding than most schools in Michigan, the numbers don't show the massive debt that Detroit Public Schools has accumulated. $3.5 billion. For context, Donald Trump is only worth about $2.1 billion. He couldn't even pay off Detroit Public Schools' debt. In Grosse Pointe, teachers are paid $72,000. In Detroit, teachers only receive about $56,000 and are difficult to retain. Turnover in Michigan urban school districts is already high at a staggering 24.3%. The national turnover rate for teachers is 15.7%. Turnover at schools with a high minority population and low family income rates is even higher, and teachers who leave those schools tend to move to schools with a majority white population and high family income rates. High turnover rates at a school negatively impacts the student body that studies there. The National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research found that students who attend schools with high turnover rates generally score lower in ELA and math. This evidence suggests that teacher retention directly affects the student body's performance. In addition to the difference in quality between largely white, richer public schools and largely minority, poorer public schools, private schools are known to provide an even higher quality of education than public schools. Heather McGee, a Black American political commentator, states that we are as segregated in our school system as we were before Brown. We have an entire new category of private schools that did not exist before Brown. This segregation truly is prominent. Black students only make up 9.3% of all privately educated students in America. Brown versus Board of Education may have outlawed segregation in public schools, but private schools can bar off minorities through high tuition costs, and they do. The perks of private education can only be enjoyed by the wealthy, who tend to be white. While public schools provide a certain standard of education, private schools can provide many opportunities for their students that public schools couldn't dream of. As the majority of private school students are white, Black children are left out. This appears to be purposefully instated rather than a coincidence.
Racial inequality is a significant issue that generates biased standardized tests. This is a major problem given that these tests mean so much to one's future. Don Hardy, author of How Race and Class Relate to Standardized Tests, said on the 2015 SAT taken for college admission, the average combined score for whites was 1576. For African Americans, it was 1277. This gap exists between all minorities. Hardy explains on the 2015 SAT, Hispanics' average scores range from 1343 to 1347, depending on nationality. For Asians, it was 1654. There are many reasons why this divide exists. First, minorities tend to earn less income. This in turn offers these kids fewer opportunities to get SAT and ACT tutors. Also, some test questions are made to intentionally trick or confuse minorities, causing them to answer incorrectly. In New Evidence of Racial Bias on SAT by Scott Josick, he states, a new study may revive arguments that the average test scores of Black students trail those of white students, not just because of economic disadvantages, but because some parts of the test result in differential scores by race for students of equal academic prowess. Lastly, the home life of these students is not easy. Preparing for standardized tests are not students' primary concerns. When it comes to higher education, these minority students will have a much more limited path due to the low and unfair standardized test scores. While many colleges and universities make opportunities available for kids with lower test scores, such as the adversity score, this still does not solve the issue that the tests are inequitable between different races and minorities.
While we have explored that school funding is directly related to student performance, we must also recognize the other effects of poor funding on students. For example, socialization is dependent on 4 factors: school, family, peers, and media. This leads us to ask our audience to consider the possible differences in student socialization between poorly funded schools and those with much more funding. Students who attended highly funded schools have much different school experiences than those who went to poorly funded schools, radically changing socialization between those two groups of children. This highlights the extensive effects of poor funding as it reaches beyond just academic performance.
Bridging the gap. The improvement of the resources provided to minorities involving the education system is not a problem with one quick solution. It requires many people to agree with each other with what is right and what is fair. To do this, they would need to set aside their implicit bias and compare the education systems of minority groups and that of Caucasians. The Board of Education needs to analyze each step: how to declare funding, how to encourage more qualified teachers to teach at academically poor districts, and how to encourage people to attend an education where they don't believe they'll succeed. Funding. To address the allocation of funds to predominantly minority-populated school districts, Education Board directors need to equalize the resources given to them and given to those who are predominantly Caucasian. They can do this by comparing the amount of money given to each district. Instead of rewarding the highest achieving district, they can investigate the lower achieving ones and find in what ways they aren't higher achieving and why. Then they can use their funds to raise the lowest achieving district to a higher standing. Standardized test scores. This will also improve the standardized testing scores of minority groups. In addition to doing this, they can fund optional instruction in how to best succeed in standardized tests, such as the SAT, in the chiefly minority-populated districts. A large part of the difference in standardized test scores is due to tutoring many Caucasians receive. Offering tutoring for minority groups helps to change this. Survey results. A survey was sent out to pertain how students felt institutionalized racism in education and what they could do to fix it. In the survey, approximately 67% of participants experienced racism in education, while 24% never did. 59% of the respondents believed racism played an active role in education. 13% believed it didn't, and 18% didn't know. When asked if they thought students could change racism and its role in education, 82% replied yes, and 18% replied no. What can students do? Speak up. This can be done by calling it out when witnessed, telling those in higher positions when you witness it take place, making it known that institutionalized racism shouldn't occur by creating a student group. Education. Students, teachers, and their administrators alike can spread their knowledge of institutionalized racism to ensure it isn't carried out by ignorance. Education will allow for less injustices to be made.
With the lack of resources, minorities are not given the same tools as other students, meaning they will be best qualified for jobs that require little autonomy and heavy supervision, as well as those with lower educational requirements. When we look past elementary and secondary education, we see a shockingly evident disproportion of minorities in the STEM workforce. This is just one example of many high-paying fields that is dominated by white Americans. However, it reveals a larger underlying issue that is rooted in our school system. Ultimately, racism plays an active role in today's American education system. Minorities lack monetary and academic resources that other students receive, thus creating staggering differences in academic progress between them and their race-dominant counterparts. As we explore the relation of racism and its place in our school systems, we must understand that the U.S. education system was institutionalized solely for the white population of America. Although it now includes minority children, there are still flaws to our system that are in dire need of change.